In a busy part of Ibadan, where the sun rose early and the sound of traders filled the air, there was a church called Fire of Glory Ministry, a place that used to be full every Sunday, with people singing, clapping, and crying as they prayed, believing, truly believing, that their lives would change. At the center of that church stood Pastor Kehinde Babalola, a tall man with a loud voice, always dressed in shining suits, always walking like he owned the ground beneath his feet. People once loved him. They believed he was sent by God. They trusted every word he said, and they followed him without question. But Pastor Kehinde was not alone. There was his wife, Deaconess Kehinde Babalola, a woman who never smiled unless a camera was on her, always dressed in expensive clothes, always watching people, always judging. And then there were their children, starting with Tunde, the only son, 22 years old, tall and handsome, but always with his face buried in his phone, even during prayers, even during sermons, even when people cried at the altar. And then came the twin daughters, Kemi and Yemi, both 20, always dressed in tight, shiny clothes, always fixing their hair, always recording videos, even in church, even during worship. People whispered about them. They talked in low voices and exchanged knowing glances, but no one ever said anything openly, because this was the pastor's family, and in Fire of Glory Ministry, the pastor's family was simply above correction. Not far from the church lived a young woman named Adaeze, and Adaeze was different. She was quiet, kind, and always smiling, even when life wasn't kind to her. She sold akara by the roadside with her mother, waking up before sunrise every single day, her hands always smelling of oil, her eyes always tired, but still, she never complained. Her dream was simple. She wanted to go back to school, she wanted to become a nurse, she wanted to help people. But money was the problem, and it was always the problem. Still, every Sunday, Adaeze would dress in her best simple gown, carry her small Bible, and walk to Fire of Glory Ministry because she believed, deep down, that God could change her story. And at first, it felt like he would. One Sunday morning, as the choir sang and people danced, Adaeze stood at the back, clapping softly and smiling quietly to herself, until suddenly, Deaconess Morenike stepped forward, took the microphone, and let her eyes move slowly across the crowd, scanning every face, judging every person in that room without saying a single word. Then she spoke. "Some people here," she said, her voice sharp and deliberate, "don't know how to dress like children of God. Look at yourselves. Tight clothes, short skirts, showing body everywhere. Is this how you want God to bless you?" The church went silent. Adaeze lowered her eyes, and even though the words weren't meant for her, they still hit her heart deep and quietly painful. But then she looked up again, and what she saw confused her completely. Kemi and Yemi were sitting right there in the front row, their clothes tighter than anyone else in that church, their phones raised high, recording themselves, laughing softly between themselves, and no one said a word, no one even looked their way, because no one dared. After service, people gathered outside. Some were smiling, some were not, and the air between them carried a tension that nobody wanted to name out loud. Adaeze stood near the gate when she heard two women talking in low, careful voices, the kind of voices people use when they're sharing something they know they shouldn't. "Did you hear what Pastor said last week?" one of them whispered. He mentioned Sister Bola's problem, the one she told him in private. The other woman shook her head slowly, saying, "It's not right. Counseling is supposed to be private, but now everybody knows her business." Adaeze felt something strange settle in her chest, something cold, something she didn't have a name for, but she pushed it away, telling herself quietly, maybe they are just talking, maybe it's not true. Later that week, Adaeze made a decision because she'd been hiding something painful, something she had never told anyone, and she believed with everything in her that Pastor Kehinde could help her. So she went to the church office, her hands shaking as she knocked on the door. "Come in,"
a voice said from inside, and she entered slowly, stepping into a room that suddenly felt much smaller than it looked. Pastor Kehinde sat behind a big desk, smiling, and Deaconess Morenike sat right beside him, watching Adaeze closely, the way someone watches a thing they're already deciding what to do with. Adaeze swallowed hard and said softly, "Sir, Ma, I need help." They both leaned forward, and the pastor's voice came out calm and steady as he said, "Speak, my daughter." And so Adaeze did. She told them everything. Her struggles, her fears, her pain, and even the secret she had never trusted anyone else with. She cried as she spoke, the words coming out in broken pieces. And they listened, or at least they looked like they were listening. When she finished, the pastor nodded slowly and said, "Don't worry, God will handle it." And Deaconess Morenike smiled slightly, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was something else entirely, something Adaeze couldn't quite read, something that sat uneasy in her spirit long after she'd left that room. That night, Adaeze had a dream. She was standing inside the church alone, the lights all off and the altar completely empty. And then suddenly, she heard voices whispering her name, soft and close, as if they were right beside her ear, saying, "Adaeze, Adaeze." She turned around, but there was no one there. Then she saw something sitting on the altar, a mirror, still and waiting. And she walked toward it slowly, her heart beating faster with every step, until she finally looked into it. And what she saw made her scream, because the reflection staring back at her wasn't her own face. It was the faces of Pastor Kehinde and his wife, both of them smiling. Adaeze woke up sweating, breathing hard, her heart racing so fast that she had to sit up and press her hand to her chest, whispering to herself, "It's just a dream." But deep inside, she wasn't so sure. Meanwhile, at the church, things were starting to shift in ways that couldn't be ignored. People were talking more, some had stopped coming altogether, some were angry, and some were quietly, deeply hurt. But Pastor Kehinde refused to see any of it, pacing back and forth in the living room and telling his family, "They are under attack. The devil is fighting this church. That is why people are leaving." Deaconess Morenike nodded in agreement and said, "Yes, they are ungrateful after everything we've done for them." Tunde didn't even look up from his phone, and Kemi and Yemi were laughing between themselves, recording another video, completely unbothered. And outside, the church that was once overflowing with voices and music and faith was slowly, quietly becoming empty. Something was coming, something heavy, something that had been building for a long time, and no one inside those walls was ready for it. And Adaeze was already standing right in the middle of it.
The days after that strange dream did not feel normal for Adaeze, even when she tried to act like everything was fine. Even when she smiled at customers and helped her mother fry akara by the roadside, something inside her kept whispering, quietly but persistently, that she had made a mistake. Still, she pushed the feeling away because hope is a stubborn thing. It refuses to die even when the truth is standing right in front of you. "Adaeze, turn the akara before it burns," her mother said, tapping her lightly. And Adaeze replied with a forced small smile, "Yes, Mama," as she flipped the balls of akara in the hot oil. But her mind was far away, lost somewhere in that office, replaying the moment she had told Pastor Kehinde everything. On Sunday, the church felt different. The crowd was smaller, the singing was weaker, and even the air felt heavy, like something unseen was pressing down on the room. Adaeze sat quietly at the back, her fingers tight around her Bible, her eyes moving slowly around the room, as if she was searching for something she couldn't name. And then the pastor stepped onto the altar. "Today," he began, his voice loud and sharp, "God has revealed something to me." The room went still. Adaeze felt her chest tighten, and she didn't know why, but something inside her was already afraid, already bracing for what was coming next. "There is someone here," Pastor Kehinde continued, pacing slowly across the altar, "a young woman
who has been hiding a secret, a shameful secret. Adaeze's breath caught in her throat, her hands beginning to shake as she whispered inside her heart, "No, no, it can't be me." But then the pastor said it clearly and without hesitation. Her name is Adaeze, and the world stopped. Everything around her went silent, and in that silence, people turned, eyes landing on her from every direction, judging her, whispering about her, and she could feel every single gaze like a weight being pressed onto her chest. "She came to me for counseling," the pastor continued, his voice loud, filling the room. "And what she told me is a sign of sin in her life." And Adaeze's ears began to ring, the word reaching her in broken pieces because her heart was pounding so loud it felt like it would burst right through her. Then Deaconess Morenike stepped forward, her face calm but her eyes cold, saying with quiet satisfaction, "Some people think they can hide their dirty lives, but God sees everything and He reveals it to His servants." Adaeze's vision blurred, tears filling her eyes as she stood up slowly, her legs barely holding her, but she couldn't stay there, not anymore, not for another second. As she walked toward the door, the whispers grew louder around her, voices saying things like, "Is it true?" and "She looks innocent, oh," and "You never know these people," each one hitting her like a small stone, sharp and deliberate. Outside, the sun felt too bright and the air felt too loud, and Adaeze ran. She didn't know where she was going. She just ran, her tears streaming down her face, her heart breaking a little more at each step she took. That night, she sat in her room staring at the wall, lost somewhere far inside herself, until her mother knocked softly and asked, "Adaeze, are you okay?" And Adaeze said nothing because she didn't know what okay meant anymore. Meanwhile, inside the Babalola house, there was laughter. Kemi was scrolling through her phone laughing as she said, "Did you see her face? She looked like she wanted to disappear." And Yemi joined in without missing a beat, saying, "Honestly, these people think they can hide things as if daddy won't expose them." Tunde smirked without even looking up and said, "They should know better. This is not a small church." And Deaconess Morenike sat on the couch, looking completely satisfied, adjusting her dress as she said, "That is how to correct people. Public shame brings repentance." And Pastor Kehinde nodded slowly, saying with full conviction, "Yes, God used us today."
But not everyone agreed, and in the days that followed, the whispers inside the church grew louder. More people were talking, more people were leaving, and the cracks that had been forming for a long time were finally starting to show. One of those people was a young man named Chinedu, who had been in the church for years, kind, respectful, always the first to help when someone needed it. And he cared about Adaeze, not in a loud way, not in a showy way, but in a quiet, steady way that didn't need an audience. When he heard what had happened to her, something inside him broke. "This is wrong," he told his friend Emeka, shaking his head. "You don't expose someone like that, especially something they told you in private." Emeka sighed and said, "Bro, just leave it. You know how this church is." But Chinedu shook his head firmly and said, "No, I can't keep quiet." That evening, Chinedu went to see Adaeze, and he found her sitting outside her house, staring into space, the kind of stillness that comes from a person who has cried everything out and has nothing left. For a moment, he just stood there, watching her. Then he spoke softly, saying, "Adaeze." She looked up, her eyes red and her face tired. But when she saw him, something in her expression softened, just slightly, and she said quietly, "You heard." Chinedu nodded and sat down beside her, saying gently, "I'm sorry. What they did, it's not right." Adaeze looked down, her voice breaking as she whispered, "I trusted them. I thought they would help me." And Chinedu clenched his fist at his sides, saying quietly but firmly, "They don't deserve that trust." For a moment, they sat together in silence, the evening breeze moving gently around them. And then Chinedu spoke again, his voice low and careful, saying, "There's something I need to tell you." Adaeze looked at him and asked, "What is it?" And he hesitated, as if he was choosing every word deliberately, before saying slowly, "I don't think you're the only one. I've heard other people complain, people who went for counseling, and somehow
Their stories ended up in sermons. Adaeze's heart skipped, and she asked, "So, it's not just me?" And Chinedu shook his head and said, "No, it's a pattern." A deep silence fell between them, heavy and full of everything they both now understood. And then Adaeze asked the question that had been quietly growing inside her all along. "What do we do?" Chinedu looked away for a moment, then back at her and said simply, "We speak up." Those two words felt heavy, dangerous even, because speaking up against Pastor Kehinde was not something people did in that part of Ibadan, not openly, not without consequences. Adaeze's heart raced. She was scared and she was hurt, but deep down, underneath all of that fear, she also wanted justice. And so she said finally, her voice shaking but firm, "I'm with you." That was the moment, the choice, the step forward into something far bigger than either of them had fully prepared for. What they didn't know was that someone had already seen them. From across the street, sitting inside a packed car, Tunde lowered his phone slowly, and a small smile spread across his face as he muttered to himself, "Interesting." And just like that, the game had changed, because sometimes the very moment you decide to fight back is the moment the real danger begins.
The next morning came quietly, but nothing inside Adaeze felt quiet anymore. Because once your trust breaks, it doesn't just hurt, it changes the way you see everything. She woke up early as usual, helped her mother prepare the akara, greeted customers with a soft voice. But behind her smile, something had shifted, and she was no longer the same girl who had walked into that church with hope in her chest. She was watching now, she was thinking now, she was asking questions she had never thought to ask before. Later that day, she met Chinedu again, this time behind a small shop near the market where fewer people passed and fewer ears listened. And when she looked at his face, she could tell immediately that he had something to say. "I spoke to someone yesterday," he said, his voice low and careful. "A woman named Mama Grace. She stopped coming to church 3 months ago." Adaeze leaned closer and asked, "What did she say?" And Chinedu exhaled slowly before answering. "Same story. She went for counseling, told Pastor Kehinde about her marriage problems, and then the next Sunday, he preached about it, mentioning details that only she could have known." Adaeze's eyes widened as she repeated, "Fighting God?" And Chinedu said quietly, "Yes, that's how he controls people." Adaeze felt anger rise inside her, not loud, not wild, but deep, the kind that burns slowly and doesn't go out easily, and she said firmly, "We have to expose this." Chinedu looked at her carefully and asked, "Are you ready for what that means? Because once we start, there's no going back." Adaeze swallowed hard, and for a moment, she remembered the way people had looked at her in that church, the whispers, the shame, the humiliation, and something inside her hardened as she said, "I'm ready." What they didn't know was that they were not alone in this fight, but they were also not alone in being watched. That evening, inside the Babalola house, Tunde sat on the couch scrolling through his phone, a slow smile forming on his face as he said casually, "They're planning something." Pastor Kehinde looked up and asked, "Who?" And Tunde replied, stretching lazily, "That girl, Adaeze, and that boy, Chinedu, they've been meeting, talking, asking questions." Dickiness Morenike's eyes narrowed as she repeated slowly, "Asking questions?" And Tunde nodded, adding with small air quotes from his fingers, "Looks like they want to expose you." A heavy silence fell over the room. And then Pastor Kehinde laughed, a deep and confident laugh, shaking his head as he said, "Let them try. Do they know who they are dealing with?" Deaconess Morenike smiled slightly and said, "They will learn." And just like that, a plan began. The next Sunday, the church was even emptier than before, the vacant chairs telling a story that no one on that altar wanted to hear. But still, the service went on, and Adaeze and Chinedu sat together at the back, their eyes alert and their hearts beating fast because today they had decided to speak. But before they could stand, Pastor Kehinde began to speak, and something about his tone was different. There are people in this church, he said slowly, who think they can bring down what God has built. Adaeze froze, and Chinedu clenched his fists at his sides as the pastor continued. They go around spreading lies, trying to destroy the work of God. And then he paused, looked straight toward the back of the room, straight at them, and said clearly, Adaeze, Chinedu, stand up. The entire church turned again, eyes landing on them from every direction, and Adaeze's heart dropped as Chinedu's jaw tightened, but slowly, steadily, they both stood. These two, the pastor said, pointing at them, have been meeting in secret, planning to attack this ministry. And murmurs spread through the room, confusion and shock rippling from row to row, until Chinedu said quickly, his voice strong and clear, "It's not true. We just want the truth." And the pastor cut him off with a sharp silence that stilled the entire room in an instant. Deaconess Morenike stepped forward, her voice calm and deliberate as she said, "They are being used. The devil has entered them." Adaeze felt tears rise again, but this time they weren't just tears of pain. They were tears of anger, and she let her voice come out shaking but loud enough for the room to hear as she said, "You told my story, something I told you in private. You said it in front of everyone." And gasps filled the room around her. For a moment there was silence, and then Pastor Kehinde shook his head slowly, his voice shifting to something softer, almost pitying, as he said, "My daughter, when God reveals something, I must speak it." Adaeze stared at him, and in that moment she saw it clearly. Not a man of God, but a man hiding behind God. And she said, steadily and without flinching, "You are lying." The words hung in the air, heavy and dangerous, and then everything changed. Deaconess Morenike's face hardened as she said sharply, "Enough! Leave this church." And Chinedu stepped forward saying, "You can't just..." But Pastor Kehinde thundered, "Leave!" And just like that, they were pushed out again, out into the harsh sunlight, out into a world that suddenly felt colder than before. But something worse was still coming. That night, Chinedu got a call from Emeka, whose voice was already shaking before he even said anything. And Chinedu frowned and asked, "Why? What's wrong?" And Emeka hesitated before saying, "I heard something. Tunde is planning something against you." Chinedu's heart skipped as he asked, "What do you mean?" And Emeka said, "I don't know everything, but I heard them talking. They want to destroy your name." Chinedu went silent. Meanwhile, Adaeze was at home, trying to rest, trying to think, trying to breathe, and then someone knocked on her door. She opened it slowly and froze. Standing there was Tunde, smiling a calm, slow, dangerous smile, and he said softly, "Good evening, Adaeze. Can we talk?" Adaeze's heart began to race because something about that smile didn't feel right, and deep down, she already knew. Things were no longer just bad. They were about to get worse.
Adaeze stood at the door, her hand still on the handle, her body tense and her heart beating fast, because nothing about Tunde standing there felt normal, and nothing about his smile felt safe. "Tunde, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice low and careful. And Tunde leaned slightly against the doorframe, relaxed, as if he had all the time in the world, as if he wasn't standing in front of someone whose life his family had just turned upside down. "Can't I visit?" he said with a small shrug, his tone almost playful, but his eyes were watching her too closely, and Adaeze didn't smile back. "No," she said simply, "not like this." A moment of silence passed between them, and then Tunde chuckled softly and said, lifting his hand slightly, "Fair enough. I'll be honest. I came to help you." Those words hung in the air, and Adaeze almost laughed, but she didn't, and instead she repeated slowly, her eyes narrowing, "Help me? After everything your family has done?" Tunde tilted his head and said, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more serious, "You think I'm like them, but you don't know the full story." And something about the way he said it made Adaeze's chest tighten, made her listen, even when she didn't want to. "What story?" she asked carefully, and Tunde looked around quickly before leaning in closer and asking, "Can I come in?" Every instinct in Adaeze told her to shut that door, but curiosity is a dangerous thing, and slowly she stepped aside. Inside the small room, Tunde sat down, looked around briefly, then focused on her again and asked directly, "You want to expose my father, right?" Adaeze crossed her arms and said, "Yes," and Tunde nodded slowly and said, "Good." Adaeze blinked and asked, "What?" And Tunde leaned forward, his voice now low and serious, repeating, "I said good, because I want the same thing." The words hit her like a sudden wind, and she stared at him and said, "You're lying." But Tunde shook his head and said, "I'm not. I've been waiting for someone like you." Adaeze's mind raced, nothing making sense, and she asked, "Why? Why would you want to expose your own father?" Tunde leaned back, exhaling slowly, as if he'd been holding something in for a very long time, and said quietly, "Because you think you know him, but you don't."